Okay. Sure. Yeah.
Good morning. Welcome. Today we're going to hear testimony regarding the various commodity exemptions, the Boxcar exemptions, and the intermodal or TOFC, COFC exemptions. Before I get started today, I just wanted to take a moment to express our condolences to the Reiser family. Jack Reiser, who works here as a transportation industry analyst, passed away last night. He's one of our newer employees, and he is one of our family, and it's just a very sad day because of that, and we'll miss him dearly. So if you could keep his family and his wife, Chris, in your thoughts and prayers, we'd appreciate that. And why don't we just take a quick moment of silence just to remember that. Thank you. And back to the business at hand. Like many issues that come before the board, these exemptions have a historical context. In the 4R Act of 1976 and the Staggers Act of 1980, Congress reduced the Interstate Commerce Commission's direct oversight of railroads in various ways. One way it did so was by directing the ICC to exempt railroad activities when it found that regulation was not necessary to carry out the national rail transportation policy, and either the exemption was of limited scope or regulation was not necessary to protect shippers from the abuse of market power. In the Staggers Act, Congress directed the ICC to pursue exemptions aggressively and to correct any problems that arose through its revocation authority. Consistent with that congressional directive, the agency exempted numerous commodities, services, and types of transactions from regulation. An exemption excuses carriers from virtually all aspects of regulation, even though the board's continuing jurisdiction over exempted movements also extinguishes any common law cause of action regarding common carrier duties. So for exempted movements, rail customers can pursue legal remedies under the Interstate Commerce Act only if they first successfully petition the agency to revoke the exemption. There is a statutory standard for revoking them. Parties can come before the agency and seek partial or complete revocation of an exemption. Partial revocation allows a shipper of an exempt commodity to pursue regulatory remedies here at the board. For example, in one case, the board revoked an exemption for crushed or broken stone, sand, and gravel in response to a complaint that a railroad was blocking another railroad's ability to fulfill its common carrier obligation. A long time has passed since the agency began exempting traffic from regulation. Today, exempt traffic accounts for roughly 40% of all freight revenue, or about $20 billion per year. So this is a very important matter. That's why the board has decided that the time has come to have a public discussion about the exemptions and their effect on the rail industry, its customers, and the general public. Just a few procedural notes regarding the testimony itself. As usual, we'll hear from all speakers on the panel prior to questions from the commissioners. Speakers, please note that the timing lights are in front of me on the dais. You will see a yellow light when you have 1 minute remaining and a red light when your time has expired. Please do your best to keep to the time you have been allotted. I assure you that we have read all your submissions. There's no need to read them here. After hearing from the entire panel, we will rotate with questions from each board member until we have exhausted the questions. Additionally, just a reminder, please turn off your cell phones. I look forward to hearing the testimony of the parties, and I'd now like to turn it over to Vice Chairman Nottingham for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Elliott. I'll be brief. We have a lot of witnesses today, and I welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We have quite a full room here, and I imagine we've got some people on the internet watching via the web too. I'll just note a little bit of the history that the chairman touched on. We were directed to adopt exemptions in a pretty sweeping way by the Congress. Industries came to us and asked for these exemptions years ago. And in the ensuing years, we've had very few cases. In fact, during my tenure, really none that I can think of, where industries or companies have come in and availed themselves of the statutory right that has been in place for many, many years, which is to petition the board, as the chairman touched on, for a partial or a complete revocation. So I look forward to hearing today as to regarding whether, if this is a problem, why haven't people availed themselves of the tool that's been available for so many years to seek relief, and if there's something that the board is doing or not doing that makes that process untenable. I want to understand that a little better. I'm a big believer in self-help. Too often we encounter interested parties around this town and elsewhere who would rather complain about something than actually take the steps necessary to correct it. And I'm all about correcting problems and solving problems, and that's what brings all of us, I think, into public service. So I look forward to hearing from everyone today, and I keep an open mind on this. I urge folks not to read too much into it. The board historically has conducted oversight hearings on interesting and important issues. Doesn't mean anything in particular necessarily, but it's an important part of what we do to stay current, to see whether circumstances truly have changed to a degree that might warrant a regulatory adjustment or a recommendation to Congress or some other board action. So with that in mind, I appreciate again the attendance today and look forward to hearing from everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman, and now we'll hear from Commissioner Mulvey.
Thank you, Chairman Elliott. A personal note to begin with, Jack Reiser was part of a team of transportation specialists who briefed me on the state of the railroad industry on a biweekly basis, and I will tell you, we will very much miss his contribution, and he was an important part of the STB, and he'll be missed by all of us. I am pleased today that the board is having this hearing, and I look forward to hearing the oral testimony. Several years ago now, I first suggested that it might be a good idea to periodically review exempt commodities and traffic to ensure that the exemptions were still appropriate. I have always thought that it's important for the board to be aware of what is going on the ground in the rail industry that we regulate and the ship industries that are affected by that regulation. This particular hearing allows the board to get information from industry participants on whether there have been any major changes in the competitive landscape that would merit the board's reconsideration of any specific exemption. After all, the ICC exempted the first commodities more than 30 years ago. That was fruits and vegetables back in 1979. The last commodity that was exempted was back in 1998, and that was non-ferrous metals. And between those two periods, more than 100 other commodities types and traffic types have been exempted from regulation, following a finding by the agency that regulation was not necessary to primarily because there was sufficient competition from other transportation modes, chiefly trucking and to a lesser degree barge. Well, much has changed since 1979 in the transportation competitive landscape. It's changes within the railroad industry, changes in the trucking industry, and to some extent changes in the barge industry as well. Likewise, many of the industries shipping exempted commodities have also experienced significant changes. Some of the pleadings filed in this proceeding suggest that the only mechanism by which the board can or should be made aware of such changes is in a specific exemption revocation proceeding. I'm sure that this is an issue that we will hear more about today. In my opinion, however, regardless of any steps the board could take, I hope that our stakeholders would not have the board turn a blind eye for decades as to whether or not competitive changes undercut the basis for an exemption. This is particularly so when you are talking about industries characterized by smaller shippers who may not be inclined in the first instance to initiate an exemption revocation proceeding. Indeed, this hearing could serve as a way to develop ideas about how the board could make its exemption revocation process more efficient and more accessible, an effort the board has recently undertaken with regard to rate reasonableness cases. Now, to echo what Vice Chairman Nottingham has said, I also want to make clear that this is primarily an informational hearing. I have seen suggestions that the board is poised to eliminate many or all exemptions, force economic regulation of every commodity, or otherwise return the rail industry to its pre-stagnant condition. I think that such suggestions encourage our stakeholders to line up with their most extreme positions. Whether you support a particular exemption or not, most would agree that exemptions have played an important role in reducing economic regulation of the railroads, and reduced regulation has contributed to the growth and innovation in the railroad industry. So from my perspective, this hearing is about ensuring that the board has the most up-to-date competitive information about the industry it regulates. And finally, I want to make note that I believe that most regulations and most regulatory practices, such as exemptions, should be subject to periodic review to ensure that they still make sense. Regulations that have outlived their usefulness or serve as an impediment to economic progress with no concomitant benefit to society should be reviewed and repealed if need be. The President has made it clear that he believes that regulations should be efficient and be in place only when they benefit the national well-being. I hope to hear more today about what the appropriate time period should be reviewing exemptions from STB regulation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Mulvey. Thank you, Vice Chairman Nottingham. Now we'll begin our first panel, starting with the panel number 1, Federal Government, and we'll hear from the U.S. Department of Transportation, Peter Plotke, and you have 10 minutes allotted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. My name is Peter Plotke. I am the Deputy Assistant General Counsel for Litigation for the U.S. Department of Transportation, and I am presenting the views of the Department in this proceeding. The Department appreciates the opportunity to be heard on this important matter this morning. The Board has instituted this proceeding in order to review certain categorical exemptions from regulation, specifically exemptions for certain commodities, for boxcar traffic, and for trailer-on-flat car, container-on-flat car traffic, which I shall refer to this morning as intermodal services. Exemption provisions pertaining to railroads go back to the enactment of the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act of 1976 and the Staggers Rail Act of 1980, the latter encouraging greater use of exemption authority. As the Board stated in its instituting notice, this proceeding arises from informal inquiries questioning the relevance and/or necessity of existing exemptions given changes in the competitive landscape and in the railroad industry that have taken place over the past few decades. The Board requested comments as to the effectiveness of these exemptions in the marketplace, whether the rationale behind any of these exemptions should be revisited, and whether they should be subject to periodic review. As noted in the Department's filed comments, the Department's best data regarding the railroad industry's performance in these 3 areas that are subject to this proceeding relates to intermodal services. Moreover, the Department's rail freight policies have recently emphasized the importance of the development of intermodal services. Accordingly, my comments today, like the Department's filed comments, will focus on intermodal services. Overall, the Post-Staggers Act regulatory environment has allowed railroads to respond to market forces that have demanded lower costs, greater productivity, and more innovation in the form of new transportation services. A significant aspect of these improvements is the growth and evolution of intermodal services. Over the last few decades, improvements in intermodal services, such as double stacking, have increased intermodal capacity and efficiency and have thereby allowed these services to better compete with other modes, particularly in the long-haul market. Thus, for example, in 2007, rail intermodal had a 64% share of the market for shipments of greater than 2,000 miles. In the Department's view, numerous public benefits are to be derived from the continued growth of intermodal services. These include benefits in the area of safety, environmental sustainability, economic competitiveness, state of good repair, and livability. As to safety, rail fatality rates per billion ton miles are significantly lower than for trucks. By moving some of the growth in truck traffic onto rail, there will be a reduction in the growth of truck ton miles with a likely corresponding reduction in truck-related fatalities. Rail intermodal services also have an advantage over motor carriage in terms of fuel consumption. With less fuel consumption, fewer greenhouse gases and other pollutants are emitted into the atmosphere. This also carries with it less dependence on petroleum and its sometimes unreliable sources. For economic competitiveness, rail's ability to offer shippers a total package of lower logistics costs means that savings can be passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices for goods and stores. For U.S. manufacturers, keeping logistics costs low means goods are more competitive in domestic and world markets. With respect to state of good repair concerns, moving more freight by rail will help contain the public costs of maintaining and repairing the nation's highways. And finally, with fewer trucks on the highways, congestion is reduced, which improves livability. In light of the myriad public benefits of intermodal services, it should come as no surprise that the Federal Railroad Administration's National Rail Plan Progress Report, submitted to Congress in October of last year, laid out a goal of developing strategies to attract 50% of all shipments 500 miles or greater to intermodal rail. To be sure, motor carriers do play and must continue to play a critical role in keeping freight moving safely and efficiently throughout the United States, particularly for pickups and drop-offs at the origins and destinations of freight movements. However, as Secretary LaHood has emphasized, it is the Department's goal to see more freight move via rail, and toward that end, the Department has begun to make substantial investments in freight rail's ability to build capacity as part of the Tiger Grant program created by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, supplementing the significant private investment already being made by freight railroads. In deciding how to allocate these grant monies, the Department evaluates the public benefits that will be derived from their use on particular projects, and in each instance, federal grants have been combined with private sector funds and other public monies. In light of its commitment to the continued vitality of intermodal services, how then does the Department view the intermodal services exemption? The Department observed in its written comments that its ultimate views on exempt traffic, intermodal or otherwise, will be informed by its better understanding of the issues after a factual record is developed by knowledgeable parties. While the Department has found the comments filed in this proceeding informative, the Department's views on the intermodal services exemption expressed in its written comments have not changed. At this juncture, it is still not clear to the Department what role the intermodal services exemption has had in promoting the growth in intermodal traffic. While freedom from regulation has allowed railroads to introduce new services without being concerned about the possibility of their rates and practices being regulated, it is highly unlikely that intermodal services would have been subject to regulation even in the absence of an exemption, because intermodal rates have, in the past, been closed to variable costs. In the future, however, as rail's competitive position is strengthened, particularly on long-haul intermodal movements, where it has a significant cost advantage over truck movements, intermodal rates may rise significantly above variable cost. Thus, the Department continues to believe that this and the other exemptions should be evaluated on their merits, and that each evaluation should be based on a careful, focused review conducted on, for example, an exemption-by-exemption basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Plotky. Why don't we go to Vice Chairman Nottingham if you have any questions.
I have no questions. Just want to thank Mr. Plotky for joining us. It's always good to have the Department before us. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I also want to thank you for coming and speaking before us. It's very informative, very, very useful. I did have one question, though. You did say that based upon the Department's analysis, the exemptions themselves cannot be credited for the increased rail market share for intermodal traffic. That the traffic would probably have not been regulated anyway because so much of it was above the threshold, 180% of variable cost, revenue variable cost. Is that correct?
Well, I think the latter half of that is correct. With respect to the first half, I think we have seen no evidence suggesting that. I don't think we have definitively analyzed the evidence because we simply haven't, or definitively reached a conclusion on that first point because we simply haven't seen sufficient evidence on that.
And the exemptions, I think, help the deregulatory process. The deregulatory process helped the railroads, but making that link between the two, I think, is more difficult. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
I have no questions, but we do thank you very much for participating. We always appreciate it when the Department participates in our proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd now like to call forward panel number 2, which is the Railroad Interest Panel. Thank you for coming here today to participate in the hearing. We will hear from the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. First, we'll hear from Richard F. Timmons, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. It's good to be here and appreciate the opportunity to testify this morning. I am Richard Timmons, President of the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association, which is the national trade organization that represents approximately 540 Class II and Class III railroads. On behalf of our members, I thank the Board for inviting testimony on the commodity boxcar and intermodal exemptions. The Short Line Association believes that the exemptions are effective, have worked exactly as intended by Congress, and benefit both railroads and shippers. There is no need to revisit the rationale underlying the exemptions because petitions to revoke provide sufficient opportunities for aggrieved parties to seek review of those exemptions. Moreover, the low number of revocation petitions filed by aggrieved parties demonstrates that the exemptions are not being abused. Finally, periodic reviews of the exemptions would force small railroads with limited resources to incur substantial costs to repeatedly defend the exemptions, and effectively would shift the burden of proof to the railroads to prove regulation of the subject traffic continued to be unwarranted, which approach would be inconsistent with the statutory mandate in favor of exemptions and certainly at odds with the current regulatory scheme governing petitions to revoke. The Association urges the Board to refrain from taking any action that would limit or otherwise dilute the effectiveness of the exemptions. Instead, the Board should continue to uphold the statutory mandate to exempt traffic to the maximum extent possible. Please refer to my extended remarks regarding these points, which are appended to this written testimony as Attachment 2, and are therefore made a part of it by this reference. Since the passage of the Staggers Act, almost 300 newly formed railroads have acquired light-density lines in communities across the U.S. Many short-line properties suffered from years of deferred maintenance and service deterioration and were candidates for abandonment. Short-line entrepreneurs acquired these properties, rehabilitated the track infrastructure, hired and trained staff, and revitalized service in communities that faced loss of rail service. Today, these small businesses, with median annual revenues of just under $2.5 million, operate approximately a third of the nation's rail lines and play a critical role in the economy of the communities those carriers serve. Despite operating approximately one-third of our system, small railroads earn less than 5% of annual freight revenues. Under these circumstances, it is evident that small railroads do not have a meaningful market power. These small entrepreneurial businesses do, however, provide essential services to shippers as well as communities located on light-density lines, often in rural areas. The Board should refrain from taking any action with respect to the exemptions that would adversely affect the regulatory environment in which short lines have been able to thrive. These exemptions are critical importance to short line railroads, and in practice they have worked as intended with respect to traffic handled by small roads. Boxcar traffic and exempt commodities are subject to intense inter- and intramodal competition. The vigorous competition for boxcar traffic and exempt commodities has kept prices extremely competitive. Indeed, according to the Freight Facts and Figures 2009 copy of the Federal Railroad Administration Handbook, trucks handled 60% of the freight tonnage moved by the major transportation modes. For the short lines, the competition is particularly intense. Traffic moving over shorter distances, that is 500 miles or less, is particularly susceptible to diversion to truck transportation. In recent years, larger numbers of heavier trucks and combination vehicles, along with federal legislative initiatives, have made the competition even more difficult. Even for traffic moving longer distances, short lines generally must compete with trucks and waterways as well as intermodal operators and rail truck operations on the Class 1s. Small railroads, by definition, operate small systems that are in close proximity to the Class 1 carriers. Because a short line generally accounts for only a small portion of the mileage of any interline move, shippers frequently have an opportunity to bypass a small railroad by trucking their cargo to the nearest transload facility on a Class 1 rail system. Shippers also can bypass short lines by making intermodal shipments that move onto rails at intermodal facilities served by a Class 1 carrier. These options make small railroads susceptible to traffic diversion in ways that generally do not affect Class 1 railroads. Under these market conditions, it is clear that short lines have virtually no opportunity to abuse market power, and effective competition for subject traffic is present. Accordingly, the exemptions are appropriate. It is also important to note that railroads are not the only beneficiaries of exemptions. By deregulating exempt traffic, railroads are able to compete more effectively in markets that previously were dominated by trucks, for example, the classic issue of fresh fruits and vegetables. Short-line marketing personnel fight a constant battle to preserve market share. The exemption of boxcar traffic and exempt commodities has allowed the free market to function and the short lines to be competitive. Thus, the exemptions benefit shippers by providing them with a competitive alternative to trucks or other modes of transportation. Such competition forces all modes of transportation to provide more efficient and economical service in order to maintain their market share. Shippers are the beneficiaries of this competition. Retaining the exemptions is especially important to small railroads because much of the traffic handled by short lines is covered by those exemptions. We believe that more than 50% of small railroad traffic consists of boxcar and exempt commodities. The exemptions for boxcar traffic and exempt commodities affect a much higher percentage of small railroad traffic than Class 1 traffic. Compounding this problem has been a 30-year downward trend in railroad general merchandise traffic of approximately 30 to 40%. Accordingly, any action by the board to curtail or limit the exemptions would therefore have a disproportionately adverse impact on small railroads. A curtailment of the exemptions would be unwarranted with respect to small railroads because, in general, those carriers do not have a history of abusing market power and their service is limited in scope. According to Railroad Facts, the nation's 556 small railroads operate 32% of the railroad miles in the country, but earn only 4.22% of railroad revenue. This disparity demonstrates that small roads are virtually incapable of abusing market power, either in their dealing with shippers or with connecting carriers. Similarly, small railroad operations are limited in scope. The average short line operates 71 miles of rail lines and handles approximately 13,000 carloads of traffic per year. To put these numbers in perspective, the smallest Class 1 railroad operates over 5,800 miles of rail and handles over 361,000 carloads of traffic each year. Accordingly, short line operations are limited in scope. The board should not engage in general periodic reviews of the exemptions. The revocation framework provides shippers as well as others with an appropriate mechanism for reviewing exemptions for specific abuses. In addition, because a large percentage of small railroad traffic consists of exempt traffic, instituting periodic reviews of the exemptions would force small railroads, which by definition have limited resources, to repeatedly defend the appropriateness of such exemptions. Small railroads simply lack the resources to do so. In conclusion, the Short Line Association urges the board to refrain from curtailing or limiting the exemptions, which would have a disproportionately negative impact on small railroads, to continue to rely on the revocation mechanism currently in place to correct any abuses of the exemptions, and refrain from engaging in periodic reviews of the exemptions that will force small railroads to engage in costly proceedings. The ASLRRA appreciates the opportunity to submit this testimony in Ex Parte 704 and would welcome any questions you may have at the appropriate time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons. And now we'll hear from the Association of American Railroads. We'll hear from Mr. Hamburger and Professor Willig.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, Commissioner Mulvey. We appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. As usual, I find myself in violent agreement with General Timmons and wish to associate myself with his excellent remarks. There are four fundamental considerations I hope that the board will keep in mind as you evaluate the comments and testimony in this proceeding. Number one, there has been no change in the law or congressional policy favoring exemptions. Statutory provisions as well as attendant congressional policy and guidance to the board has not changed. By law, the board is required to exercise its exemption authority to the maximum extent possible. The board and its predecessor, the ICC, have followed the direction of Congress with respect to granting exemptions. Through ICTA in 1995, Congress not only validated the agency's approach to exemptions, but in fact actually expanded the board's mandate to be more aggressive. Since the board has appropriately followed congressional policy, and that policy has not changed, there is no legal or policy basis for the board to change its approach to exemptions. Number two, the statutory test for revocation is that the reapplication of regulation is necessary to carry out rail transportation policy. While Congress mandated the board to utilize its exemption authority aggressively, it provided for exemptions to be revoked only if there is an abuse of market power by the exempt rail carrier. Accordingly, the test for revocation is not whether an exemption is still necessary. It is instead whether re-regulation is necessary. And that depends not on the financial condition of the industry, not on whether there are no longer tariff filing requirements, not whether rates may be higher or lower than before. As my written testimony details, and as Professor Willie will explain more fully, the test is whether there is no effective competition for the exempt movements at issue and that the rail carrier is abusing its market power regarding those movements. It is important to note that the burden of showing the need for revocation rests with the party seeking that revocation. The statute does not provide for the board to initiate revocation proceeding on its own initiative, unlike proceedings to exempt traffic, which the statute does specifically authorize you to initiate on your own. Issue 3. The testimony in this proceeding does not support any conclusion that there is an abuse of market power regarding any exempt transportation. Even if the board could initiate a proceeding on its own, the facts do not support any further board action in this proceeding. The testimony presented by other parties does not rise to factual presentations necessary to support a petition for revocation of the boxcar, intermodal, or any entire commodity exemption. You will hear more from other railroad witnesses on this issue. However, I wish to highlight one factor relating to competition for exempt transportation. As Professor Willie noted in his written testimony, revenue cost ratios for particular commodity or car type movements are not necessarily indicative of an absence of effective competition. However, a low revenue variable cost ratio has been determined by statute to be a conclusive presumption of effective competition. On the screen you can see that all boxcar traffic revenue variable costs since the exemption was instituted in 1987 is currently at a point below the rate of the RVC in 1987. Similarly, for all commodities, the rate is at approximately 148, 149%, far below the 180% level for jurisdiction here at the board. And I will point out that this is masked revenue, and so that the actual numbers are probably lower than you see here. Issue 4. Re-examining well-established and proven underpinnings of rail regulatory policies, both in this proceeding and in Ex parte number 705, introduces uncertainty into the industry. The board has taken these actions at a critically inopportune moment for the railroad industry and its various constituencies. After many decades of decline, attributable in large measure to overregulation for much of the 20th century, America's freight railroads have succeeded in achieving enviable productivity gains and solid economic growth in an era of decreased regulation. This has resulted in the railroads achieving improved returns, which in turn has permitted them to reinvest heavily in their systems. The very regulations, or absence of regulation, being discussed today are the very reason that railroads are such a critical part of the U.S. economy and our nation's financial recovery. Due to the certainty governing our industry today, railroads have been able to invest $480 billion since 1980 to build a world-class network that reliably and safely delivers for American businesses. That investment, which must continue unabated in the face of demands for more capacity, improved service, and attendant environmental, job creation, and other public benefits, has been made possible by the board's implementation of ICTA, consistent with congressional directives. Re-examination with the overhanging threat of possible reversal of those policies introduces uncertainty into the marketplace. To conclude, the board has properly utilized the exemption authority granted by Congress to exempt traffic from regulation. These actions have contributed to the ongoing rail renaissance, and there is nothing in the law, in congressional policy, or in the testimony in this proceeding which would justify the board taking any action to reverse the proper course it has followed to date. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, notice that the light has stayed green this whole time. I'm about to change that. Maybe I have some extra time. I do thank you very much for the opportunity to share my views on the economic rationale for the board-granted exemptions and the framework for evaluating whether to revoke an exemption. I underscore the phrase economic rationale. I am an economist. I'm used to working with lawyers all the time, but prefer to stay on the economic side of that boundary line. And I welcome discussion later from the economic point of view. So I'd like to start with some basic economic principles. In the freight and railroad business, regulation of prices, I feel like we're booming here, is only needed when there is an absence of effective competition. And market forces are not able by themselves to generate prices that are conducive to what economists call economic efficiency. Even stronger than that, though, I think for today's purposes, is the statement of principle that where there is effective competition, and we know there are such widespread instances in the industry, it is best by far not to regulate. It's not just regulation ought to be there if we don't have effective competition, but where we do have effective competition, I think, as a matter of economics, that is very important not to regulate. And it's important, moreover, in such circumstances to have as much of an institutional commitment as we can to not regulate. Because where there is the possibility of competition driving market outcomes, the overhang of the possibility of regulation, I think, is a real deterrent to negotiations and market forces doing their best for social efficiency for all the parties involved. I think only with that kind of commitment not to regulate in the face of effective competition, only then will market decisions and negotiations work optimally to create efficient outcomes. I believe that exemptions can foster such good market outcomes by providing some of that targeted commitment to market forces. And from my point of view, when I think about some of the issues at hand, some of the costs of the hearings that may be necessary to investigate the future of exemptions, obviously it's a costly process for those involved, but I think there's real economic costs involved in terms of weakening the commitment to staying away from regulation, where most likely that regulation is not needed to get competitive outcomes. So looking back, the STB's Rate Regulation Authority is therefore appropriately focused, and it has been appropriately focused, on specific markets where there is demonstrable evidence of abuse of market power, or at least a high risk of such conduct. And where there is no such evidence, exemptions do help and have helped competition work for the public interest. And that is my view as an economist looking back over the history. The ICC and the STB have appropriately exempted particular commodities and services from regulation whenever the evidence demonstrated that they were subject to effective competition, whatever the source of that competition, whether it was based on intramodal forces, intramodal, product, or geographic competition. The full range, as you know, has come into the assessments of the degree of effectiveness of competition for the purposes of assessing exemptions. Your decisions in this area and your predecessors for exempting boxcar traffic, intermodal, traffic, lumber, wood products, rock salt, and so forth, a very long list, were all based, as I read the record, on very well-documented empirical evidence of the effectiveness of all of these types of competition in the marketplace. I think it's a really good record as I read it from an economic point of view. At the same time, as I understand it, your exemption decisions expressly kept open the possibility of revisiting to address any evidence of any specific abuses of market power that might be shown to exist. But you have correctly, I believe, enforced the requirement that any proponent of revocation of an exemption must demonstrate through well-supported evidence that the market conditions that originally supported the grant of the exemption have been altered so significantly that re-regulation is now required. These requirements, as I understand it, are well-supported, pointed evidence about the traffic that is made to be at issue, instead of some sort of general claims of, quote, well, the times have changed, that ought to be enough, or platitudes, if I may, about exemptions, quote, having served their purposes. due to some higher view of railroad profitability instead of those general platitudes. Is not that insulting a word, is it? But as in contrast to really well-pointed empirical evidence going to the important subject at hand. But with those generalities expressed, I want to emphasize, apart from platitudes, that rising prices or improved railroad profitability generally are absolutely not appropriate justifications for revoking exemptions. Instead, these dynamics, prices going up, prices coming down, finances of the railroads doing better, sometimes doing worse, are ordinary and frequent outcomes of competitive markets. These are not signs in either upward or downward of market power necessarily, because in competitive industries we see finances oscillating back and forth, we see prices going up and down, driven by competitive market forces. So if I may, oh, there it is. Well done. Figure 1, this is in my written testimony. And if anybody like me is a little bit colorblind, you cannot tell these line graphs from each other. So I'm here to tell you what my PowerPoint reveals if you have the live computer. So take a look from the right-hand side of the picture, and I'm going to be going down the list from high to low of these different line graphs. So the very top one on the right-hand side is a broken dark line, and that's a trace of the volume of rail traffic as collated by the AAR. The next one, which looks red even to me, is the AAR's measure of rail productivity. Third one is total revenues, again, AAR data. The fourth one down is the AAR view of a broad price index of rail freight traffic. Next one down is revenue per ton mile, so a price surrogate, as collected by Christensen and Associates. A word about that in a moment. The last line is the marginal cost of rail traffic averaged over the commodities and the volumes in question, again produced by Christensen and Associates. This is the Christensen Study of competition that I believe was requested, supported by the board, and has been updated a few times, and which I feel is an absolutely excellent study. Christensen's a terrific economist, and he's used real state-of-the-art methods here, as well as pertinent data in my view. So let's take a look at this and see what it says about the dynamics of the industry. A good anchor is 1980, which is the passage of the Staggers Act, of course. All these lines come together in 1986 or 1987. There's no significance to that. That's just the base for these indexes. So they're all the indexes are 100 in that year by construction. What's remarkable, though, is that if you start at 1980, look above 1980, all kinds of good things start to happen right after the passage of the Staggers Act. Productivity, that red line, really jumps. It's been flat all those years. It really takes off right after the Staggers Act. The pricing lines, they've been flat. Right after 1980, they all start going down in strong ways. Marginal costs start to come down. All kinds of good competitive dynamics begin when real deregulation or the opportunity for deregulation under the Staggers Act sets into the industry. It's a remarkable sea change. And in fact, the textbooks on regulation all have charts that look something like this and say, oh my goodness, look what the Staggers Act did empirically. The next sea change begins around 2004 when new dynamics set in, rates begin to increase, productivity starts to turn down, and marginal costs begin to rise right after 2003, 2004. A very different dynamic, probably kicked off by the huge increases in fuel prices that begin right around those years. And right around those years, marginal costs begin to go up, and rates go up right along with the marginal costs, as one would expect under competitive circumstances. Yeah, save me. I talk loud, right? Is that the problem? I think I'm addressing people like 100 yards away. Big classrooms. So this dynamic, prices being driven by marginal costs being driven by both productivity and the exhaustion of the easy productivity gains, attended to deregulation, and the drivers of wildly increasing fuel costs are all things that are characteristic of competitive markets and competitive pricing dynamics, and in no way support a view of abuse of market power or some generalized weakening of competition in the industry. Another point to help to make that is, unfortunately, in 2008 or so, way over on the right-hand side, the big recession begins to have effect, and there's a fast decrease in volume. Rates begin to soften because the demand is really soft due to the decline in the economy. Meanwhile, there's still capacity congestion in this marketplace, and that's part of the reason why rates begin to increase in the middle of the decade is real congestion in the railroad network, real bottlenecks that raise congestion costs. And even though the recession really takes a lot out of the growth of volume, it doesn't entirely stop that capacity congestion. And so we see rates softening and coming down, but not nearly as much as they would if the capacity congestion problems were fully solved. Well, hopefully that's going to happen. The railroads have been investing. The number I have is some $74 billion over the first decade of this millennium, despite the turn down of finances during the recession years. And the railroads are making, I understand, significant strides to address the capacity constraints that we see in these data. This very significant reinvestment in the private freight rail network is inconsistent, if you think about it, with any suggestion, which seems to come up in these conversations, the suggestion that the industry might be exercising market power artificially to restrain capacity and thereby drive up rates. That's just not consistent with these data. The opposite appears to be true. Volume continues to go up. That's not the hallmark of market power at all. And the industry seems to be investing hand over fist as the investors will provide the funds, which is certainly not characteristic of some sort of a conspiracy or a collection of unilateral approaches, I told you, to try to keep things congested and thereby more profitable. So improving profitability is clearly not a sound indication of any need for revocations. My economic bottom line on this, and I can't state this strongly enough, no matter how well or badly any railroad is faring financially overall, competitive services should be free of price regulation. It's not about the overall finances. It's about market by market. Is there sufficient competition to feel like pricing will be driven by efficiency? And that's a market by market determination. It does not have anything to do with the overall finances of the railroad. Likewise, regulations should be considered for services that are truly market dominant and subject to abuse of market power, irrespective of the overall finances of the railroad. This is a neutral principle. It really goes in both directions. So that leaves the question on the table. You did your time to me, right?
May I cede my time?
Thank you very much.
That's fine. That's what
So the question remains, how should the propriety of maintaining exemptions be gauged? It's not overall finances of the railroad. So I have an economic answer. It's written out at some length in my file testimony, but let me just state it here in a condensed form. It is if a convincing showing can be made, based on facts and evidence, not rhetoric, that a particular movement is no longer subject to the forces of effective competition, resulting in abuse of market power, then the board, if presented with an appropriate petition, may have grounds to investigate whether re-regulation is necessary and appropriate to protect the public interest. And in such an investigation, the board should, if you'll allow me to give you advice, the board should take care to focus as narrowly as possible to address the concerns identified and not to sweep more broadly than necessary, because, again, there are real economic costs to threatening regulation rather than committing to not regulating where there is effective competition. In other words, any revocation of an exemption should be carefully limited to the particular movements or circumstances as to which an abuse of market power has been shown by rigorous evidence to exist. So I thank you for your patience. Thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts and concerns. I do think this is an important matter. And again, I urge you to proceed with caution and care. The downside is sending the wrong signals to the marketplace, which could actually threaten the availability of investment funds to help keep up the capacity that we need to handle traffic growth. My admonition is, like the physicians, do no harm. But please, as an economist would say it, do not eliminate exemptions that well serve the public interest in competition. And I thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, panel, for your participation. I just had a couple questions. First of all, I just want to clarify on your chart, Mr. Hamburger. On the second part, it says all non-boxcar commodity. Does this chart include intermodal?
It does not.
It does not? So the intermodal is...
We did not put intermodal here. The testimony from Ayanna and others indicated that was not particularly an issue of contention. We do have that analysis. I believe currently intermodal is about at 132% of RVC.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify so I understood the chart. With respect to the overall numbers, the amount of traffic, and RVC ratios, those numbers appear, obviously they're all under 180, and I've seen, now, in that instance, those are good numbers, and then what about in specific instances where a specific commodity has numbers that are over 180? I've had our economists do some waybill analysis, and in one instance we have, of course I'm taking the most extreme, is crushed limestone, which is a serious commodity. You carry quite a bit of it. Is at what we had for 2009 at 272. In an instance like that, would you think that is a good indicator of market dominance, or the railroads are exercising their market power?
Well, let me start, and then I'll turn it over to the economist. Of course, for you to consider it, I would suggest that there needs to be a filing of a petition for revocation, number one. Number two, as Professor Willig stated, the RVC is one indicia of whether or not there is competition and whether or not there is abuse of market power. But let him go into that in more detail.
Thank you. Economics has a pretty well-defined conclusion on using revenue to variable cost or revenue to marginal cost ratios as possible indicators of market power. And I'm sure you're well aware of this, but of course where there are important fixed costs, sunk costs to the infrastructure, and these are extraordinarily high in railroading across all industries, somebody's rates are going to have to be well above variable and marginal costs to even begin to attempt full cost recovery on a going forward long-term basis. And so finding that some traffic has rather larger than average ratios of revenue to variable cost should not be upsetting at all, or in any way viewed as an indicator of the kind of market power or monopoly power that we look to regulation to control.
Okay, and so you're saying it could be an example of how we regulate here with differential pricing?
Yeah, that obviously is differential pricing, but I don't look at that, an example of that kind, as necessarily pointing to the abuse or exercise of market power.
And then we had other examples. We had them take a look at how traffic, the amount of traffic traveling, exempt traffic, by commodity, traveling at over a 180 RVC ratio has increased from 93 to the present, to 2008 was the last number. And I'll give you another example, which isn't the most extreme, but looking at stone and glass products, it went from 14% traveling over 180 to 41%. It went from 14 to 17 in 98 to 30% in 2003 to 41% in 2008. And this is once again off the waybill analysis. What about that as an indicator? Same type of question.
Well, I would repeat the same answer, but then fill it out a little bit more, because in that time period, particularly as we get to the middle of the 2000s and out to 2008, first of all, fuel costs are rising very fast. And just as a matter of the arithmetic of the way the variable costs are calculated, they're kind of slow to reflect big upward movements in fuel costs. So some of that changing ratio could be the impact of very fast rising input costs not being fully reflected in the VC data. Likewise, congestion, which has been a big factor since the last 8 years or so in railroad operations, and of course the railroad people can speak about that later on today. Congestion is an important determinant in the market for business, but also for economics that goes into appropriate competitive rate making. If you've got a scarcity of the rail resources, which could be the track, it could be the cars, it's proper to see prices rising under those circumstances. The way we figure variable costs, the way we all do it in this industry, those costs don't really reflect congestion the way the economists' view of marginal costs do. Marginal costs include congestion. It's hard to measure that, but conceptually marginal costs rise a lot when the scarce resources become more scarce and there's more congestion, but the VC formula does not reflect that. So we might very well be seeing enlarged revenue to variable cost ratios without there being an enlargement of the true ratio of revenue to marginal cost under conditions of fast rising fuel costs and also under conditions of congestion. So I'd be just cautious in reading those tea leaves.
Thank you. One follow-up on Mr. Hamburger's comment. With respect to having to file a petition in order to initiate consideration of revoking an exemption, I think that's a very strong argument. But at the same time, I also look at our cases where we reconsider decisions that have been made by the board, and as a result of changed circumstances or new evidence, maybe material error, that we do reconsider past decisions. Do you think that would be applicable in this instance?
No.
I'm surprised you said that.
Last, the short answer.
Yeah. In general, I would say, not in general, specifically, the statute directs you to pursue granting exemptions. That is what you are statutorily directed to do, and it lays out a process where the burden of proof is on those seeking the repeal. There has to be a finding that it is necessary for the transportation policy. So I would stand by my statement that it requires a petition to be filed.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions, so
Thank you.
Commissioner Mulvey.
Thank you. I share your the burden of working with lawyers like you are an economist. So, couple of things. Again, with this revocation of exemptions, you pointed out that we've only had a couple of examples where people have come forth and asked for revocation of an exemption, and we did grant it. The case I'm familiar with was one with cottonseed oil in Texas, where it was charged that the particular shipper was not giving, the particular railroad, short line railroad, was not giving good service, and the board revoked the exemption because cottonseed oil was exempted, and then addressed the problem, and I think successfully. But the shippers often claim that it's not that they would like to, it's not that they can't do it, it's that it's expensive, it's burdensome, and they would do it more often if they felt that the procedures were simplified. Do you think there's any merit to that argument? The reason they don't ask for more revocations of exemptions is that they're unsure of the board's processes and that there's an uncertainty involved? Ed, you want to address that?
Well, there is, of course, uncertainty in any legal proceeding. So, you know, if what one is looking for before one brings a case is an automatic guarantee that one is going to win, I would suggest that will never happen. But as far as the cost, that is something that is generally between you and OMB as to how you are able to set your filing fees, et cetera. And we certainly have never supported high filing fees, and I've always testified in favor of having the board processes open to the maximum extent possible.
And the board is making an attempt at doing that. We have lowered our filing fees for many things, and we are trying to streamline our processes. So perhaps that might lead to more petitions for revocation.
Streamline processes help not only plaintiffs but defendants.
One of the issues that one of your charts for both Boxcar traffic and the other is that that's the average of all the traffic in that group. But in fact, there's always a distribution in any average, and that as the chairman mentioned, there are some cases, we have just some examples of some commodities, some types of traffic where the revenue to variable cost ratio is far, far, far above 180, and more importantly has been climbing steadily in the last few years. Do you have any sense of, are there any commodities out there that are currently exempt that you feel have a more or better case to call for a general revocation of exemption, or should it always be on a case-by-case basis, and should it always be for a specific movement, and that there shouldn't be any commodity revocation? Mr. Willis could also suggest that, so as we both could suggest that. I'm sorry.
To the extent that a revocation submission can meet the burden of showing that there is a lack of competition, that there's an abuse of market power, and that re-regulation is necessary, if that is for a commodity-wide basis or a specific movement, that is up to the petitioner to decide how to file. What I was trying to get across in these two charts is that, generally speaking, there does not appear to be that kind of rigorous support for commodity exemptions to be revoked. But the board has a process in place to allow those who feel that their facts can support such a filing to come forth and make the filing.
Yeah, the mean can always hide a lot of outliers, and that will.
And I will not concede that there is any abuse, but theoretically speaking, it is possible that there is an outlier there, and suggest again that the board has in place a process for that theoretical outlier to come forward.
Professor Willick, I know that you are a strong believer in the existence of competition. I spent quite a bit of time in the airline business looking at the issue of contestable markets, and I know you have views on that. And but are there some cases where there seems to be some bands of traffic that are more or less competitive with other modes? For example, relatively short-haul modes, with the short line serve, relatively short-haul traffic tends to be truck competitive. And, of course, if you're near barges, then you have water competition, if you're near waterways. But isn't it true that for certain long-distance traffic, regardless almost of commodities, but for real long distances, rail is really the only option today, that there have been important changes in, say, trucking markets where you've got a shortage of drivers now, the price of fuel has risen for trucks on a relative basis, and relative importance of those costs, much more for trucking than for rail. So have there been enough changes in competitive marketplaces, especially for long-distance markets, that there might be some places now where we really should review the overall exemption process? Mr. Willick.
Well, just in terms of the process of today, the railroad marketing officials will be speaking, I think, to certainly much more accurately than I can to the facts involved in any particular area of traffic that you'd like to ask about. But at the same time, I mean, I'm well aware as an economist, and I know you are too, that the length of the haul matters a lot in terms of the balance of cost between trucking and rail. But I'm also aware that when it comes to very long haul, that mixtures of rail and truck are very empirically important, and I think in general attractive to the shippers. And if there's going to be a trucking portion of a long haul total movement with rail in the middle someplace, that fosters railroad to railroad competition for providing the railroad part of the long distance haul. So truck to one or two or three different choices of railroads, trucks at the other end, makes for a relatively more competitive long haul to kind of fill in the gaps that you were alluding to.
And I guess I'd just add for the record, if I could, that Joni Case will be testifying later on behalf of the Intermodal Association of North America, J.B. Hunt, and the Hub Group have also filed written testimony as large intermodal users, and they are very much in support of maintaining the current exemption.
Mr. Willick, President Willick, you also mentioned the Christensen study that the board commissioned a while back, and that it was good work. I wonder if you're aware that one of the principal authors of that study has recently completed a paper that shows that the railroad productivity gains, which in the early years were passed on to shippers, virtually 100% were passed on to shippers in terms of lower rates. But today, over the last 4 or 5 years, the railroads have actually kept the benefits of the productivity changes instead of passing them on to shippers. And would that be a suggestion that there has been a shift in terms of the railroad's ability to exercise market power?
I actually haven't studied the paper that you're alluding to, and you're now interesting me a lot in doing it.
We'll make sure you get a copy of that paper. I think it's a very interesting one.
Well, if that's what it shows, but without commenting specifically in that paper about the impact of competition, I wouldn't jump to that conclusion just from the fact that you alluded to, that productivity gains have continued, although of course they've dropped off in the last few years, when there are other things going on in the market, like extraordinary increases in fuel costs. So that would get in the way of what would ordinarily earlier have been that same relationship.
That's all for the time being.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Vice Chairman?
Thank you, Chairman Elliott. General Timmons, if I could, did I hear correctly you mentioned that currently there are about 556 short line railroads? Was that the number?
Yes, that's correct.
And do you happen to know if we were to flash back to 1976 when the 4R Act first raised this whole exemption issue and put it very solidly into statute, what the short line industry looked like back in 76?
In general numbers, about 250, 260, somewhere in that realm.
Do you think there's any connection between, or is it just a coincidence that the 4R Act and staggers were passed in 76, 80, and your association membership has been able to grow thanks to practically a doubling of the number of short lines operating?
I don't think there's any question about it. I don't think there was any conscious intent or awareness that the short line industry would expand as rapidly as it did post-1980. The interesting developments that the Staggers Act produced was a growth of short line mileage at about that time of about 8,000 miles of short line mainline track, and today it's slightly under 50,000 miles. Now, as you know, that there were a large number of Class 1 railroads in 1980, and they had reduced dramatically by 1990. And in the decade of the 80s, Class 1 railroads divested themselves of many, many properties that were less than economically feasible for their purposes, and small railroad entrepreneurs and others gathered those pieces up, even though they were a little broken down and dilapidated, decided that they could, with flat overhead, smaller staffs, and local customer interface, thought that they could build them, and they did. And that evolution has continued to this day. Obviously, it's slowed down pretty dramatically. But there's no question that staggers had a dramatic impact on the small railroad industry.
Thank you. Professor Willig, if I could, thanks for sharing and reviewing the charts. Some were quite familiar, and we appreciate the reference to the Christensen Study, too, which about $1 million of taxpayer money went into that study through the board. It's probably I would suggest, the most important study that the board has commissioned in many decades, and I do commend everyone's attention to it. I think it's still very timely and relevant, even though it's just a few years old now. In the science of economics, how do you account for, I guess I'll just use the phrase, sort of the people who aren't winners? You're not here to suggest that every single customer of railroads came out a winner across the country as a result of the deregulatory policies of the 70s and 80s, are you? I mean, we do hear, of course, from people who say, with all seriousness, that their situation has worsened. How does the sort of science of economics kind of account for that or explain that?
Well, we're always happy to find a situation where everybody is happy, but it's a very rare occurrence in today's world. The normative stance that applied economists, microeconomists frequently adopt takes a look at the size of the pie and tries very hard to support, to understand what the best policies are from the point of view of the total real income generated by, say, a sector of the economy like the freight transportation sector. The whole idea of differential pricing, which goes back again to staggers and to the regulatory rulemakings following staggers, deliberately adopted the point of view, I'm not sure in these words, but we economists know the connection, pricing that would enlarge the size of the pie of real income created by a better performing railroad industry than it had been performing prior to the Staggers Act. Surely some of those rate changes were up, some were down. On average, they were way down. But that's not to say that some people's rates didn't go up. The real interesting question, though, is what's the backdrop? What are we comparing what actually happened to? And if the backdrop is more bankruptcies and more dysfunctionality in the entire industry, lack of capitalization, lack of service of the quality that all the shippers need for their own businesses, then it could very well be the case that everybody was benefited against the backdrop of no well-functioning railroad industry at all. We always talk that way, but here we really have empirical evidence that pre-4R and poor staggers, the industry was basically bankrupt. And so it's not wrong to say that all shippers who find railroad freight opportunities important to their business have been benefited by the entire movement toward rationalization and deregulation.
I could step back and maybe ask a big picture question. In your line of work, I assume you get to hang out, for lack of a better phrase, with academics and experts in a variety of fields of regulated industries and the economics of a variety of regulated industries. I'm thinking of financial sector, energy sector, other sectors.
We do hang out, yeah.
It's
academic conferences. We work hard, but we also
curious. What's the if you look back at what's happened in our economy the last 10 years, some of the explosive scandals in the electric utility industry with the Enrons and of the world, and then more recently in the financial services sector. We've seen a lot of finger pointing about whether or not a variety of federal and state regulatory entities fell down the job or didn't fall down the job. What do you say to those colleagues when you turn and look at the state of the freight rail industry and how it's been regulated and kind of what the results of that regulatory relationship and oversight have been?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Commissioner. I just filed some testimony this week in a matter of financial regulation under Dodd-Frank. And I must have spent a page and 3 footnotes saying, and for goodness sakes, try to get it right the way the ICC and the STB have in railroading. All the bad things that went on, all the pitfalls that we have learned to avoid since Staggers and since the 4R Act in this industry are real threats when it comes to other regulatory bodies without the experience, and I dare say the skill that has been developed in this industry. And I actually wrote, don't make the mistakes today that the rail industry has learned to avoid in the last 20, 30 years. Maybe your ears were turning red with embarrassment at the praise. I just filed that the other day.
I wasn't aware of it, but
yeah, I'll send you a copy.
Please do. Thank you. Mr. Hamburger, what do you say to your members' customers who sincerely feel that they were not the winners as an outgrowth of the 4R Act staggers and the trend towards deregulation of the rail industry? Professor Willig has confirmed that there are people who don't come out winners in these circumstances. What should they do? What options do they have, and what can?
I've tried to make the same point that the professor made, obviously not as eloquently as he did here this morning. But the point being that a railroad system that is 20% in bankruptcy with 25% of its track on slow orders, which takes too long to get across the country, cannot provide the service needed for this economy. The president has said he wants to double exports. We take 1/3 of all exports to port. Without the freight rail industry, we're not going to double exports. We're not going to get the increased employment that the president's looking for out of doubling those exports, and that comes because we were able to pour $480 billion back into the network in the last 30 years. And so that, in my opinion, benefits anybody who ships by rail. Whether or not a particular RVC ratio for a particular shipment may have gone up or down, I think the professor's point that the pie has grown for everybody is the appropriate way to look at it.
And your members, when they're operating under an exemption, presumably they're obviously they're not dealing with tariffs. They're dealing in the world of contracts, I assume, with or various pricing agreements, service agreements with their customers.
I'll leave that for the rail panel, I think.
Okay. So I do want to explore what the real world options are for rail customers in the exempt commodity area if they have a problem. I do also want to throw out, and I've confirmed this with our people here, that just because one works in an exempt commodity field does not preclude a shipper from coming to this board for informal relief through our Rail Consumer Assistance Program. And so I do want to commend, I'll probably be repeating this a couple times today because it will be a long day, and I want to make sure folks who are coming in later for later panels here too, if you are in the exempt commodity field and you have a problem with the way you're being treated by a freight railroad, let the board know about it. We're working with the freight railroads every day. We have a variety of relationships and a variety of ways to get the railroad's attention, and it's not all bound in statute, and sometimes it's informal, and it's a successful program, the Rail Consumer Program, where we resolve thousands of complaints a year, and I did want to commend everyone's attention to that as well. Thank you. That's all I have.
Just one quick follow-up question. With respect to the standard for revocation, it's been consistently been termed to show an abuse of market power as the standard. And as I read the statute, which someone put in front of me, the statute seems to be broader, and I just wanted to clarify why you had chosen, I guess, that aspect of the rail transportation policy. But the statute requires regulation where it's necessary to carry out the transportation policy of Section 10101 of this title. And is there a reason why you specifically were referring to abuse of market power?
Yes, if you'll take a look at the legal appendix to my statement, it comes from prior ICC and STB decisions. That has been become the accepted standard.
All right, thank you. And one final question that I had. This is just a concern I had about the whole process in place at the present time. Hypothetically, if you have an exempt commodity and they want to come to us, they have a complaint, and as a result, they have to seek revocation. They can't go to the state courts or go to the courts because we still have jurisdiction over it. What would happen in the instance if there was an instance like if there was a service problem under a contract and the party wanted to seek revocation to come to us to deal with that? However, the revocation process, as I understand it, doesn't let you look backward at all. Do you think there is a void there for a remedy for parties that are have a complaint about service or other issues not regarding money? I know with respect to money, you come to us and you have to go prospectively, but doesn't that open itself up for abuse on other issues like service matters and things of that nature? Do you think there's a void there from your understanding of the way the process works?
I would prefer that I think you respond to that in writing.
Sure, that's fair. I don't have anything further. Do you?
Yeah. A couple of minor questions. Mr. Timmons, welcome back. You talked about the importance of not getting rid of the exemptions, and isn't it also true that you talked about the problems of determining market dominance, and isn't the 180% revenue variable cost ratio just that give protection? Would you have relatively few people complaining about short line movements because most of those would be well below the 180% threshold, and so therefore that serves as an effective screen against too many suits being filed against especially short line railroads?
Let me just make a general comment about that and then ask Mr. Sidman to comment further. But it seems to me that in the experience that we've had, the 180% threshold for short lines may not be as pertinent as it is for Class 1 railroads. The very, very short moves that they make and a variety of conditions that they experience, and to be sure, while we do many of the same things the Class 1 railroad industry does, the small railroads are not mirror images of Class 1 railroads. There are vast differences in a variety of things, whether it's operational tempo or hours of service or revenue generation or the settlement mechanisms that are used between the Class 1s and their interchange partners, the short lines railroads. There are vast differences, and so the 180 may not be an appropriate measure or barrier to protect us in that sense. Mark, do you have anything other?
I do. Commissioner Mulvey, I think I agree with your observation that most short line traffic would be below the 180% variable cost ratio, revenue to variable cost ratio. But it's really important to understand that with respect to abuse of market power, short lines really are not positioned to do that structurally, and that reflects a couple of things. First, that many short lines, perhaps the majority of short lines created since 1980, have ceded pricing authority to their Class 1 sellers. So they're actually not a pricer in terms of origin to destination moves. They have no interaction whatsoever with the customer, and they have a contractual allowance to which they're entitled for every car they handle. As to those who do have pricing authority, and there is a population of short lines that do have that authority, there are really two constraints on that. One is that they are pricing only a very small portion of the typical move. So, the rule of thumb number we would normally use is a short line typically is looking at 20% or less of the total revenue. But in cases in which it is a pricer of that portion, it has to negotiate typically with the connecting carrier. That's where the negotiation takes place, and their leverage in those negotiations is really quite limited. So, as a structural matter, short lines are completely different from the Class 1s, I think, in this discussion. Having said all of that, they really do need the protection of the exemptions, because the exemptions create a buffer between them and rate cases. Before it was the question was asked of whether maybe there could be a streamlined exemption process, and there was allusions made to the small rate case, which made it more affordable for shippers to bring rate cases. It's true that it had that effect. What didn't happen in the small rate case is that there were no protections put into place for small railroads that end up as collateral damage in rate cases. There is a pending case right now where a shipper brought a rate case against two Class 1 railroads who were named as defendants. A small portion of that traffic actually terminated on a whole bunch of small railroads. What happened in that case was the shipper got on the phone with each small railroad and demanded rate concessions, or it was going to be named as a defendant in the case. I advised two short lines in that one had annual car loads of that traffic of less than 100, and the other had less than 10. So, the threat of being dragged into a rate case for a small railroad, certainly under those types of circumstances, is just a complete disaster. As General Timmons said earlier, the median revenues for a short line railroad today are $2.5 million per year. These are not companies that can afford to participate in rate cases in which they have no significant traffic at stake, or in revocation of exemption proceedings, which might really be important to them, but they just don't have the resources. Those resources today are going to upgrading track to handle 286,000-pound cars, to bridge replacement, to PTC obligations. You have this whole laundry list of capital investment that you're asking a $2.5 million a year company to do. So it's, as you go forward with this, I would ask that you keep in mind, and especially in the small rate case context, keep in mind that very often short lines can end up being very badly abused in those cases without much public benefit, actually, for including them.
Thank you. On the short lines, some of the testimony that some of the pleas that we have received have suggested that the exemptions have caused some of the Class 1s to be reluctant to interline with the short lines. Would you care to comment on that? The exemptions of the Class 1s say that, well, we don't want that particular traffic, and so therefore, since it's exempted, it's not going to be a problem for us to just refuse to deal with interline with the short lines for certain traffic types.
My only observation on that would be that that issue of deciding not to take some kind of traffic is clearly has clearly existed. But whether that can be tied to exemptions or not, I'm not aware of it. In other words, the rationale for deciding not to take some kind of traffic or work some kind of arrangement for moving the goods is generally, in my experience, not tied to an exemption per se.
We heard a lot today about the importance of competition, and as an economist, we all have peons to the importance of competition in the marketplace and getting efficient economic solutions. So would you agree, Professor Willick, that agreements that perhaps limit competition would not be in the public interest?
That's a loaded question. You'd have to get more specific, I think. I mean, clearly,
I'm talking about, obviously, I'm getting off the subject here, so I was talking about paper barriers, which, of course, Mr. Hamburg and Mr. Timmons.
Interchange commitments, as we call them.
Interchange agreements would limits the short line's ability to interchange with a Class 1 one. It's spun off, so.
No,
It was a loaded question, so I'm not going to expect you to
yeah,
answer.
but I mean, as you know, and I know, in general, often there are agreements which somebody might characterize as limiting competition, which are actually an important part of competition, where there are commitments made to deal with one another, which is mutually beneficial and allows more efficiency and lower prices, but a concomitant of that is not dealing so much with the next guy who's complaining about it. So, yeah.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your participation today.
Thank you for listening.
And now we'll hear from the third panel, the shipper interests. You can please come forward. We'll first hear from the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers. Appearing on their behalf will be Jeffrey Moreno. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. My name is Jeff Moreno, and I'm here on behalf of the Alliance of Automotive Manufacturers. The 12 members of the Alliance constitute 77% of all car and light truck sales in this country. The commodities that are shipped are basically all fall within stick class 37, which are almost all exempt commodities. I am sure the board would prefer to be hearing directly from those who are affected by this particular exemption. My presence here today is indicative of a general or greater concern by Alliance members with the potential for railroad retribution. That concern is lessened by my speaking here today on behalf of the Alliance collectively. This concern is probably the best example of at least a perception among automotive producers of railroad market competition for portions of their automotive traffic. I will do my best to answer any questions that you may have this morning. However, if I'm unable to do so, I would be glad to take those questions back to the Alliance and submit supplemental responses in writing. The Stick 37 automotive traffic has been exempt since 1992. The history here is a little important because the exemption procedure in that case was not initiated by the railroad industry or any form of petition. It was one of those proceedings that was initiated, self-initiated by the ICC at the time. Most inbound parts, even at that time, were already exempt traffic under the intermodal or the boxcar exemptions. Therefore, the ICC in its decision proposing to exempt automotive traffic focused on what were long-haul, predominantly rail movements at the time, and concluded that widespread geographic competition constrained railroad market power at that particular time. There was almost no opposition at all to that proposal by the ICC. It was supported by both the railroads and the automotive industries, and therefore there was really no serious challenge also posed to any of the ICC's assumptions stated in the notice. The auto industry in particular was relatively unconcerned with the exemption at that particular time in history because the railroads were in fact aggressively competing for automotive traffic, and the exemption purported to make this competition even easier by removing such restrictions that were in place at the time as tariff and contract filing requirements. Since 1992, railroad mergers have increased the number of auto plants that are captive to the same railroad. I believe there were about 12 Class 1 railroads in 92, and we're down to 7 today. But what we really have is large regional duopolies in the eastern and western United States, which have made it easier, effectively, not to compete. There are longer bottlenecks also as a result of these mergers, which have increased the distance to the nearest alternative railroad, to the extent there is an opportunity to perhaps truck around these bottlenecks. Legislative changes only 3 years after this exemption was enacted removed most of the benefits for shippers because tariffs no longer had to be filed and neither did contracts. And that was the primary benefit from the shipping perspective. Furthermore, what we have seen particularly in the last decade is that railroad rate increases have rendered trucks cost competitive at even longer distances. Back in 92, trucks were relatively competitive up to about a 250-mile radius. Today, trucks are actually competitive up to about a 500-mile radius. That, however, is not due to more efficient truck competition, but it's due to railroads increasing their rates up to the levels of which trucks have been pricing. During this time, both trucks and railroads have in fact raised their rates, but rail rates have increased at a much greater pace. And truck rates have responded to recent economic declines, whereas railroad rates have continued to increase. I am not here today to advocate a blanket revocation of the 637 exemption. There are substantial intermodal competitive options for large portions of the automotive traffic. There are, however, significant subsets of the 637 that are, in fact, captive to the rail industry. Focusing first upon finished motor vehicles, trucks dominate the short-haul distance hauls directly to dealers. So today, if a dealership is typically within 500 miles of a production facility, it will typically move by truck to that dealership. Rail, however, dominates the long hauls to what we call transload ramps, vehicle distribution centers. They're called different names, but essentially these are facilities where the cars are offloaded from the rail car, where automobiles are offloaded from the rail cars, loaded onto trucks, and then continue on to the ultimate dealership. And rail dominates that transportation. Auto manufacturers cannot simply cost-effectively transload around a rail bottleneck, except in very isolated instances when moving their finished motor vehicles. It does occur. It occurs in very isolated lanes when there is a service problem on that lane. But there simply is not the truck capacity, and furthermore, there are significant additional costs with adding that extra transload layer. Therefore, it cannot be done in large volumes to bring any competitive pressure upon railroads. A good example of that is what's happening right now in the automotive industry. Since the beginning of the year, the car supply has been about 14% below what is needed for loading cars. Now, if it were simply an easy task to truck around these rail bottlenecks, most of this deficiency in rail car supply would be addressed by shifting that traffic to truck. It's not happened at local plants. What happens is those cars end up having to go to storage lots and waiting until rail cars are available but can be loaded. Auto manufacturers also cannot easily or cost effectively shift their production from a plant served by one railroad to a plant served by a different railroad, even when that theoretically is an option, and it's not an option as much as it was before because of the consolidation of the rail industry. A second group of traffic is the inbound shipment of auto parts. Now, this is highly truck competitive for 75% of this volume, but there is a 25% segment of inbound parts that's moved by rail because it must move by rail. And these are what we call the oversized or the heavy parts. Anything such as frames and axles, transmissions, the bulk of that moves by rail because truck is simply not an efficient alternative option. We believe the review of the auto exemptions is appropriate to address traffic that is not competitive, and that the board should recognize that due to changes since 1992, that in both the rail and in the auto industries, that it should at least undertake a review to evaluate whether the blanket exemption on sticks 32 or 37 traffic is currently appropriate, or whether some subsets of that traffic should actually still be subject to regulation. I would like to address one thing, comment that has been in most of the railroad comments and which was raised earlier today in the AAR's testimony, and it was one that surprised me. The statement that the statute does not authorize board-initiated revocations. I was baffled to hear that, and I went back to read the statute to see if I had been missing something. But the statute says in 10502B, the board may, where appropriate, begin a proceeding under this section meaning 10502, on its own initiative or on application by the secretary or an interested party. Well, by reference to 10502, they're referring, 10502 covers both grants of exemptions and revocations of exemptions. So the statute says the board can do this on its own initiative. Now, perhaps my railroad colleagues are focusing on the fact that this appears in subsection B, which deals with grants, as opposed to subsection D, which deals with revocation. But in the statute itself, when Congress intended to refer to a subpart, it used the term subpart. Here, it used the term section, referring to all of 10502. With that, I see my time is coming to a close, but I'll be glad to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Marino. Next, we'll hear from the American Forest and Paper Association and the Paper and Forest Industry Transportation Committee. Mr. Lubbock, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Elliott, Vice Chairman Nottingham, and Commissioner Mulvey. My name is Bill Lubbock. I'm the Director of Transportation at Temple Inland for our building products businesses. In this role, I'm responsible for all inbound and outbound shipments of goods and materials that are transported by rail and highway to and from our building products plants. I've worked at various roles over the 16 years that I've been employed at Temple Inland. Temple Inland is a low-cost, highly efficient manufacturing company focused on corrugated packaging and building materials. More than 117 years ago, our company started with a single sawmill and has grown to operate 82 facilities, which are consistent of 7 container board mills, also known as paper mills, 59 converting facilities or box plants, and 16 building products plants. Our company has approximately 11,000 employees and has annual revenue of approximately $4 billion. Our corporate headquarters is located in Austin, Texas. Our building products business supplies solid wood lumber, gypsum wallboard, and fiber products for residential and commercial construction projects. In addition, we produce particle board and medium density fiberboard, also known as MDF, for manufacturing of furniture, flooring, fixtures, cabinets, molding, millwork, and various other uses. Of all of our businesses, our container board mills, the paper board mills, are the most dependent on rail service. Of our 7 paper mill facilities, 7 are captive to a single shipper, single railroad. Many of our paper mill customers are also reliant on rail service, especially those customers whose facilities are constructed specifically to receive rail delivery. I'm appearing before you today on behalf of the American Forest and Paper Association, also known as the AF&PA. and the Paper and Forest Industrial Transportation Committee, also known as FITSE for short. Accompanying me is Ms. Karen Booth, she's in our audience, counsel for these organizations. I appreciate the opportunity to share the views of these organizations with you on the important question of whether the STB should undertake a more formal review of the existing exemptions applicable to the paper and forest products industry. For the reasons explained in our written comments and as expressed here today, we believe that the time has come for this agency to reevaluate whether the exempting rail transportation of paper and forest from government oversight continues to make sense based on the substantial changes that have occurred in the rail industry since these exemptions were adopted 2 decades ago. The benefits of exempt status no longer exist. Our written submission detailed the various commodity exemptions and the boxcar exemption that currently apply to most paper and forest products, as well as the key findings of the ICC that led to the granting of these exemptions. I will not repeat that information here, but would simply note that these exemptions were all adopted by your predecessor, the Interstate Commerce Commission, between 1983 and 1993. Over 20 years ago, when these exemptions were being considered by the ICC, the railroads and the paper forest industry companies jointly supported the exemptions based on the mutual commercial benefits that could be achieved from removal of burdensome regulatory requirements such as tariff and contract filing, which existed at that time. By exempting our commodities from regulation, railroads could be more responsive efficiently to the market and compete more effectively with trucks by avoiding regulatory delays, which prevented price changes from taking effect immediately.
Mr. Lubbock, would you mind talking into a mic? I'm concerned that people can't hear. Maybe it's the mic.
Is it on?
Is the mic on? Okay. Maybe our mics are defective.
Is that better?
It's not great.
Move it closer.
Better?
That's better. All right. Thank you.
However, in 1995, Congress adopted changes to law in the ICC Termination Act, which eliminated tariff and contract filing and other regulatory burdens that limited the responsiveness of railroads and therefore provided the benefits obtained by exempt traffic to all shippers. While we strongly supported the reforms adopted in the ICCTA and still do today, several of the key reasons that led to our support for an exempt status evaporated with its passage. Thus, in today's post-ICCTA environment, our exempt status provides no regulatory benefits, but even worse, results in the loss of access of existing regulatory protections. Regulatory protections on rates and service have become increasingly important to many shippers across multiple industries based on the current structure of the rail market. We believe that paper and forest product companies should have those same rights. Between 1983 and 1995, paper and forest companies also were not concerned about insufficient rail competition for their shipments, since there were many more railroads in 1983 than currently exist. While there were still over 40 Class I railroads when the Staggers Act was adopted, we've witnessed the reduction in the number of providers to only 7 Class I railroads today. The consolidation of the rail industry has resulted in many paper mills across the country being captive to only a single railroad. The situation has substantially reduced intramodal and geographic competition for paper and forest products. The reduced rail competition and captive status of many companies has allowed the railroads to impose double-digit rate price increases and to impose take-it-or-leave-it contract terms based on their substantial market power. Although truck transportation is an option for shipping paper and forest products, rail transportation is more efficient and cost-effective, particularly for long-haul movements. Many paper mills were built to receive inbound logs and ship outbound products via rail, and thus were not designed to handle substantial volumes of trucks. Weight and size limitations of trucks are also a constraint, and in some regional markets, there are truck capacity shortages. Other factors adversely affecting motor carrier costs and competitiveness include driver shortages, increasing cost due to higher fuel, and regulatory changes involving drivers' hours of service and the new CSA safety program. Finally, this agency cannot ignore the changes in the financial health of the railroads, which has occurred between 1983 and today. As explained in our written testimony, by any measure, the railroads are more profitable than ever and have achieved strong financial health. The railroad's weak financial condition in the early 1980s and 1990s was clearly a factor that the ICC considered when it adopted the exemptions decisions. The very substantial changes in the railroad's economic status is another factor supporting a review of the paper and forest products exemptions. In conclusion, although there was a broad support from our industry for the ICC to grant the paper and forest products exemptions, in the past 25 years that support has diminished greatly based on the substantial changes that have occurred in the rail industry. AFMPA and FTSE members are no longer confident that regulation is not necessary to meet the public interest considerations of the National Rail Transportation Policy, or that regulation is not needed to protect shippers from market abuses, which I understand are the exemption requirements contained in the law. We are not asking the STB to revoke the commodity exemptions involving paper and forest products at the conclusion of this hearing. Rather, we believe that it would be appropriate for the STB to initiate a more formal review of these exemptions to determine if they are still justified under the current market conditions in the rail industry. Thank you for the opportunity to present the views of the AFMPA and FTSE here today. I'll be glad to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Lubbock. Next, we'll hear from the National Industrial Transportation League, and we'll hear from Mr. Carlton. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you, Vice Chairman Nottingham, Commissioner Mulvey. We really do appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. My name is Bruce Carlton. I'm the president of the National Industrial Transportation League. Also accompanying me this morning is Ms. Karen Booth, the League's General Counsel, although she's not sitting here next to us. We have an empty chair, apparently. Again, thank you for letting us appear before you today to provide the League's views on the very important issue of railroad traffic that is currently categorized as exempt from the oversight of this board. We warmly commend you for initiating this proceeding to review the existing commodity, Boxcar, and TOFC, COFC exemptions. The League represents over 600 member companies that range from some of the largest users of the nation's and world's transportation systems to smaller companies engaged in the shipment and receipt of goods. Rail transportation is vitally important to many of our members, and within this group are shippers of commodities or users of rail services such as intermodal that are currently exempt from STB oversight. At the outset, the League would note that in this proceeding, the board is posing an extremely important but very narrow question. The board is not asking whether it should eliminate or modify all or any one of the existing exemptions at the conclusion of this hearing. Rather, the board is simply asking whether, one, it should look at these questions based on very substantial changes that have taken place in the railroad industry since many of the exemptions were adopted, and two, whether it should begin one or more future proceedings to determine if the agency's current exemptions should be eliminated or revised. The League believes that the answer to that narrow question is very clearly yes. Apparently, any number of other witnesses and those who have offered testimony and statements to the board have already advanced this issue to the second and third round before you've even decided whether you're going to take this matter up for further consideration. More than 15 and as many as 30 years have passed since the board's predecessor, the ICC, approved these exemptions. The notion that the conditions that caused the agency to take these actions have remained unchanged is counterintuitive, to say the least. As detailed in our written testimony, an examination of the facts shows that over the past 2 decades, major changes have occurred in the rail industry, including substantial reductions in intramodal rail competition, substantial improvements in the financial health of the railroads, and statutory changes to further deregulate the rail industry adopted in the ICC Termination Act of 1995. Based on the breadth and scope of changes that have taken place since these exemptions were granted and the 2 to 3 decades ago, it is completely proper and responsible government action for the board to examine whether these exemptions should be eliminated or revised. We believe that the board should initiate one or more proceedings to evaluate the utility of the existing exemptions based on current market conditions in the rail industry and the governing statute. The League believes that the National Rail Transportation Policy calls for a fair balance between the interests of shippers and carriers. When this agency or its predecessor decides to remove a category of rail traffic from government oversight, it must look at these policies and determine whether an appropriate balance exists and that the interests of the affected parties are protected. Between 1981 and 1995, when virtually all of these exemptions were approved, there were positive benefits to both shippers and carriers that resulted from the exemptions. Despite deregulation brought about by Staggers Act, the rail industry was still subject to tariff and contract filings and other pricing regulation during this time period. Exemption from regulation removed paperwork burdens, cut carriers' costs, and it eliminated requirements that made rail pricing practices less responsive to shipper business needs. Shippers and carriers both benefited from the granting of the exemptions, and many shippers jointly supported the grant of the exemptions in the ICC proceedings, along with their railroad partners. But when ICTA was passed in 1995, Congress eliminated virtually all railroad tariff and contract filings, along with other limitations on rail pricing practices. ICTA conferred the benefits obtained by shippers of exempt traffic on all shippers. Today, shippers whose commodities are subject to an exemption receive no tangible benefits from the exemption at all. They simply lose the regulatory protections otherwise available to other shippers. This circumstance, coupled with other major changes in the rail industry, would appear to upset the balance of interests achieved when the exemptions were granted. The board has asked in this proceeding whether the basis for the existing exemptions should be revisited. We strongly question whether it is proper to continue the exemptions for some commodities on the basis of benefits that are no longer meaningful. It is time to reevaluate whether some or all of the existing exemptions continue to make sense. Another key factor underlying the grant of each of the exemptions was the state of competition, but very substantial changes in the structure of the rail industry have occurred in the last 15 years, which have impacted the extent and effectiveness of competition. Given the substantial consolidation of the rail industry since 1990, the extent of rail-to-rail and geographic competition is surely diminished from where it was 20 years ago. Other modes, especially the trucking industry, are facing both capacity constraints in certain markets and new regulatory requirements. In particular, the trucking industry is dealing with initiatives from the U.S. Department of Transportation, the CSA 2010 initiative, possible changes in the hours of service rules, and next up the electronic onboard recorder requirement. All of these may render the trucking industry a less effective competitor than they were 20 years ago, especially at longer distances. Just last month, the League held a webinar for our members that examined the productivity losses that will flow from DOT's recent hours of service proposal. Further, the recently issued Senate Commerce Committee financial report on the freight rail industry quotes Wolf Research, a very respected industry observer, to the effect that railroads will, quote, likely continue to take market share from the less fuel efficient and increasingly less productive trucking industry, unquote. By all accounts, rail pricing since 2004 has increased well in excess of inflation, an important indication that competition is less effective than it has been in the past. The League believes that given these and other changes described in our written comments, the board cannot assume that competition is as vigorous as it was 20 years ago. The changes in the competitive landscape further justify a more formal review of these exemptions. Finally, another purpose for granting the exemptions was to assist railroads in achieving revenue adequacy by cutting carrier costs and permitting more responsive and efficient pricing practices. But it is very clear that the rail industry is in a much more favorable position economically compared to where it was decades ago when these exemptions were granted. Thus, it is entirely appropriate, again, for the board to examine whether these exemptions are still necessary for carriers to achieve financial health, when by all accounts they are one of the healthiest industries in America. While the railroad's testimony asked the board to ignore the substantial improvements in their financial condition, it unquestionably was a factor reflected in the ICC exemption decisions. And currently, it is a factor to be balanced as part of the national transportation policy. In conclusion, it is entirely appropriate, we believe, responsible government action for the board to examine more thoroughly whether the existing exemptions should be eliminated or modified based on substantially changed circumstances. Of course, the decision to initiate such a review does not prejudge what the findings might be. The ultimate findings would need to be based on the evidentiary submissions made in any such future proceeding or proceedings. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this morning, and we'll answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Mr. Carlton. Now we'll hear from the Wisconsin Central Group, and you speaking on their behalf will be Mr. Varda, and you have 10 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to be heard on this subject today. I am legal counsel to the Wisconsin Central Group, an ad hoc rail shippers coalition operating under the auspices of the Wisconsin Paper Council, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, and the Michigan Forest Products Council. Our group, under various names, was present, including participation in various ICC proceedings, for the transition following Staggers and the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. In the mid-1980s through the early 1990s, we were present for the withdrawal of the Class 1s from Wisconsin and Upper Michigan through various spin-offs. In the late 1980s and through the 1990s, we were present for the creation, consolidation, and successes of the independent Wisconsin Central system. And of course, we were present for grant of control of the WC system to Canadian National and its aftermath. The goal of our group is to persuade the Canadian National, or by whatever means, to assure restoration of Wisconsin Central system level of service and competition for market share for traffic that originates and or terminates on lines of the former Wisconsin Central system, and for CN's main line between Superior, Wisconsin and Chicago, a transparent plan to mitigate the impact of increasing international traffic and to provide ample capacity for serving traffic that originates and or terminates on the lines of the former Wisconsin Central. From our perspective, the problem today is a failure of competition and competition policy. From our perspective, the primary competitiveness problem is not with captive traffic, but rather with non-captive traffic. Freight competition in our region has changed dramatically since the exemptions were granted and since Class 1s have reached their present level of consolidation. The Class 1 Canadian National, which this board granted control of the WC system in 2001, has utterly failed to compete for market share on traffic originating and or terminating in our region on lines served by the former Wisconsin Central system. CN has strong incentives to not compete for, in fact, to suppress such traffic. Ironically, the board's efforts to require mitigation of the impacts of the operational changes arising from Canadian National's control of EJ&E, an application that we in Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula supported, has added incentives for CN to suppress traffic originating and terminating on lines of the former Wisconsin Central system. Given the exemptions, shippers and other stakeholders in our region including those in the public sector, such as the states of Wisconsin and Michigan, and communities like those who are in the process of forming the Blue Line Coalition, have no realistic means to get CN's attention to the problem, to say nothing of holding CN accountable or otherwise restoring rail competition in our region. The board should investigate potential revocation of the exemption. CN's treatment of the former Wisconsin Central, as described in Wisconsin Central Group's statements, illustrates, and we provided a number of very specific examples, illustrates why the board should do so. Wholesale revocation of the exemptions is almost certainly not the answer. Small adjustments or targeted revocation of exemptions may better serve to A, give competition another chance where failure of competition has been the unintended consequence of Class 1 consolidation, and B, provide adequate oversight and effective means by which individual shippers might bring attention to such problems on a case-by-case basis. The independent Wisconsin Central system is a model for the pro-competitive impacts of Stagger's deregulation, specifically in providing first-mile, last-mile retail railroad service, competing successfully mostly for non-captive freight. The independent Wisconsin Central system successfully won back boxcar freight that the Class 1 serving Wisconsin and Upper Michigan lost to highway in the 1980s. The independent Wisconsin Central system even successfully provided short-haul intermodal services, an example from Green Bay to Chicago, which with the largest customer and most devoted customer being the nation's largest truckload motor carrier. CN terminated those services. There is considerably more to this story. That's the reason for our request for investigation. We ask that the board investigate specifically to conduct an in-depth investigation of the effectiveness of the exemptions, change circumstances and implications of revocation of the exemptions, and in particular to consider the pros and cons of limited and or targeted revocation to address failures of competition policy and failures of conditions imposed on Class 1 consolidations, such as those illustrated by the 10 years of Canadian National's control of the Wisconsin Central system. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Varda. Commissioner Mulvey, do you have any questions?
I have a few. Let me begin with Mr. Varda. Are you suggesting that the acquisition by CN of the Wisconsin Central system was not so much designed to incorporate them as part of CN, but rather to eliminate them as a competitor, and this is really almost more of a merger issue than anything else? Or
not at all. Okay, not at all. The Canadian National was quite clear in the preceding Docket 34,000 that its purpose was to acquire the Superior to Chicago line. It also promised that it was going to maintain the local characteristics of the Wisconsin Central system, maintain it as a separate division to maintain those local characteristics, the most prominent of which was their Wisconsin Central's competitiveness for market share in our region.
Like competitiveness against trucks for the most part, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Mr. Marino, you're here along with the forest and paper product people. There's two industries which particularly have suffered from the current economic turndown. And are you suggesting at all that the conditions in certain industries needs to be considered when the board makes a decision as to whether or not it's appropriate to revoke exemptions, or for that matter, any other consideration by the board of a rail shipper matter, that should the conditions in your industries be a factor?
I'm not here to advocate that the exemption should be revoked because of the financial condition of the automotive industry. And in fact, it's hard to draw a broad description of the auto across the entire automotive industry in terms of their financial condition. A couple years ago, it was primarily the domestics that were in financial straits. That fortunately they have recovered and improved and emerged from bankruptcy in a much stronger position. I think it's the ability. It is relevant to the ability of the railroads to exercise their market power. It does suggest that if railroads are continuing to exercise market power, even when the industry's own survival is at stake, that there could be, or that could be an indicator of market power, or the fact that the railroads don't feel that there is competition that's emerging, effective geographic competition, for example. They don't see the threat of imported vehicles, for example, to the domestic industry.
Mr. Lubbock. In answer to your first question, is that what we're implying, that a revocation based on the economic circumstances of our particular markets? No, we're not.
Many years ago, back in 1925, I guess at the peak of regulation, the Congress passed what was called the Hoke-Smith Resolution, which required that the ICC take into account conditions in industries, primarily aimed at agriculture, in making its regulations. Fortunately, that never became law, but other things did. Again, to you two, do you see any procedural barriers for filing for a revocation? Some have suggested that it's difficult to bring an exemption revocation proceeding before the board because of its cost or its the complexity, etc., and that's why the board hasn't seen any. The railroads say we haven't seen any because there's no need for it. Exempt commodities should remain exempt. Do you have any opinions on that, views on that?
I'll share my feelings on that. Specific to building products, it's not movements of a size and scale that you would see for coal and grain. It's much more of I classify it to my management as retail purchasing of transportation, general merchandise type of movements. And we don't have the time. You can't file for a petition and get it turned around in time to help us for a 100-car movement a year. It's just, there's not a cost benefit to that proposition. So when these exemptions were put in place, it was on a macro scale. Mm-hmm. I think what we're asking for is to look at it again from a macro scale approach, and then if not revoked, then certainly look at how we could adjust them to better fit into the current and foreseeable market conditions, because the market conditions have drastically changed in this nation in the past 20 years. We see things that nobody could have forecasted.
Commissioner, could I add just a comment to that footnote? It was earlier suggested by one of the witnesses that there is no barrier because your filing fees have come down. Number one, we salute you. The League salutes this board for taking the action to reduce filing fees. I think it's the right and proper thing to do and providing some access to the public, improved access. But that's not the issue. It's not your filing fee, as was suggested earlier. It is the cost involved of diverting corporate executive time to focusing on this issue. There's a real cost to that. Number two, there's a cost in hiring counsel. With all due respect to the bar that practices here, their intelligence does not come cheaply. Number three, there's the cost of hiring consultants, perhaps not Professor Willig, but others who practice the dismal science, to make these arguments. And that is a very costly undertaking, and I would say that's a very high barrier to bringing these types of matters to your attention. And again, that's why the League is very pleased that you've asked the question, should we take a look? And again, we think you should take a look. Thanks.
So is there any suggestions as to, well, I think perhaps we'll be looking for that, suggestions as to what the board could do to lower the barriers, to streamline the process, and to make it less costly from a resource standpoint. We have the same thing with our rate cases. We've lowered our rate case filings down to a fraction of what they were, but the filing fee was trivial compared to the millions of dollars that it costs to bring a large rate case. We've tried some other approaches. We have small rate case approaches now, but there may be other things we can do to simplify the process, accelerate the process, and make the boards, make access to the board simpler, cheaper, and more effective. Let me see here. I think that's all I have at the moment. I might have further questions following up. Thank you.
That's fine. Vice Chairman?
Thank you. And I thank the panel for being with us today. Mr. Moreno, I think you probably are familiar. This board has had a very close and positive long-term working relationship with the auto industry. I know we've met as a group out in Auburn Hills and in the Detroit area on the premises of one of your big members. I've personally met privately with CEOs of the auto industry talking about this issue and related issues. I personally called Class 1 rail CEOs at the behest and urging of auto industry CEOs to talk about ways to resolve and some of these concerns. And so we appreciate your being here. I know you represent a diverse group of companies. Remind us, though, who don't the association, the alliance, represent? You said you've got about 77%. Are there a couple of big household names we would recognize that aren't part of the group, just so we know?
Well, the group is comprised of BMW, Chrysler, Ford, GM, Jaguar, Mazda, Mercedes-Benz, Mitsubishi, Porsche, Toyota, and Volkswagen. I mean, that's
right. So just, I guess Honda is one of the ones that's not.
Honda, yes, Honda is not on this list.
They do their own thing or have a different group. Gotcha. Mr. Lubbock, similarly, I think you're probably familiar. This board has had a very close and long-standing interest and working relationship with the forest and paper industry. Some of the most difficult and time-consuming cases we've wrestled with in recent years include the abandonment out in the Coos Bay line out in Oregon, where the entire board, in a almost unprecedented fashion, took staff out to Eugene, had a hearing in a federal courthouse, and made sure that our processes worked to keep that line running under new ownership. And similarly, we were up in far northern Maine in Presque Isle together, thanks to our chairman's leadership, looking into the very difficult circumstances surrounding the recent abandonment of the MM&A line up in northern Maine. That was a particularly tough impact to the forest and paper industry, and we're pleased that line is going to stay open thanks to the taxpayers of Maine and the folks there. So we do, many of these concerns are not completely new to us, and I think we do have some record upon which to understand both what's going on in the auto industry and the paper industry. And Mr. Carlson, I just want to say thank you for being here. You and I have had a chance to work very closely together back at DOT headquarters, and I just want to say for everyone's benefit, Bruce Carlton was without a doubt one of the top tier career civil servants and leaders, and just an example of the best there at the DOT, and the work you did at the Maritime Administration for many years and advising many secretaries of transportation was just incredibly valuable. I had the privilege of traveling with you internationally with former Secretary Mineta, and we just appreciate the NITLIG having you here today, and thank you. And Mr. Varda, thank you for being here. I understand these are remarkable times in Wisconsin. We're reading more and more, and not just in the sports section, but front pages of international papers now. And I'm glad you're not on strike, and you flood the state. You flooded on for a reason. You're working, and I'm not sure what happened to Mr. Zolger. I worry he may be on strike or in hiding, but we'll if he comes late, we hope he'll be able to.
He's not on strike, but they have to figure out what they're going to do for shared revenues from the state. So the communities are in a lot of trouble.
I understand, but that's really all I've got for this panel.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Just a couple questions. Back to the question that I had earlier to the railroad interests. Do the shipper interests see any concerns, a possible void in their ability to recover because of the revocation process? My example had been that you exempt commodity, so in order to come before the board, you have to seek revocation, and once you do that, are there things that you believe that you can't recover or receive a remedy because of this process? Is there something, I guess, that's not working in our process, I guess, is my question.
I'd like to answer in a little different direction. Our concern is not so much rates, but getting service. And that's the heart of it. And we're not going to recover for the customer dissatisfaction because we had to go by truck rather than rail to facilities that are designed to receive by rail, having to rearrange our outbound shipping because we don't have the capacity to ship by truck, where the facility was designed to ship by rail. We'll never recover that.
Thank you.
It's not so much a recovery cost because what you may save is difficult to quantify by having access to regulation. But I think there is even a value just in knowing that there is a regulatory safety net in those situations when you are dealing with railroads where you feel you have no other option and you're in a take it or leave it situation. Right now, when you're negotiating a contract or negotiating over some sort of dispute, you can't say, well, or you can't take this to the board. You're basically at the mercy of what you're being dictated in that circumstance. And there's value in at least having that sort of leverage, that option, because then the railroad also knows you have that option, and it takes that into consideration as well.
Thank you. Along the same lines, let's say in the instance of if you wanted to challenge a rate, it seems somewhat confusing because at the present time your rates are under contract and as an exempt group, how would you go about challenging a rate in the instance if you sought revocation, because it would seem like since your rates are all under contract, those would be automatically exempt.
Because the rates are in a contract, they are not challengeable, but contracts come up for renewal every so many years, and during those contract negotiations, if you don't, a regulated traffic, if you don't like that contract offer, you can always say, give me a tariff rate. And the railroad's required by law to give you a tariff rate, and you have the option to challenge the reasonableness of that rate if you do not like it. An exempt shipper does not have that option.
Well, yeah, and if the shipper is exempt, how would they go about, can they challenge a rate?
Not without specifically getting the exemption. Now, there is the possibility of a case-by-case exemption as opposed to revoking the class exemption.
Would they have to go about revoking it first, obtaining a tariff, and then challenging it?
Well, yes, and that's kind of that literally is the problem here. It adds an extra layer in seeking regulatory protections, and there's kind of a backwardsness to this in the context of rates. If we've discussed that one of the standards that the railroads have said would apply here is abuse of market power. Well, how do you prove abuse of market power when the proof is in the unreasonableness of the rate? So it gets circular. In order to be able to challenge the rate, you have to prove it's unreasonable, but you can't prove it's unreasonable until you prove abuse of market power.
Thank you,
Chairman. Many of us don't have contracts in the sense of a contract. It's simply if I'm a log cutter hauling to a landing, the rate is what the railroad tells me it is. It's out there someplace in an exempt publication, but it's not a contract with me. I didn't sign anything. I'm told what it is. And so there's sort of a void in there between, is it a contract? Yeah, because it's a bill of lading contract, but is it a contract in the sense of being a transportation contract on which the parties had a meeting of the minds over the terms and conditions? No. It's much more like a tariff.
Thank you. I think I'd be remiss. I asked the rail interests about the RVC, the amount of traffic that runs over 180 RVC, and my questions to them, and I used some pretty strong examples of where the amount of traffic has increased over time. From 93 to 2008, the RVC the amount of traffic running over 180. And I looked in the stick number 37 for transportation equipment, and it appears that the RVC has in fact gone down. The amount of traffic running over 180 has gone down over time. How do you explain that as an economic indicator with respect to the industry you're representing?
Well, that gets back to the issue of the blanket exemption versus the specific subsets. I mean, if you're looking at entirely 637, we don't question or even challenge the fact that there are significant areas where there is competition with the rail industry, but there are also other, with the truck industry, but there are other areas where the competition does not exist, and I think we would need to drill down deeper into that data in order to see if that holds true at the subsets that we're most concerned about.
Thank you. Just one final question from me. The railroad interests raised the issue, the health of industry. I don't know, I'm not going to quote him directly, but paraphrase it, is not really relevant to this analysis. Do you see that the same way?
No, it's not completely irrelevant. And as a matter of fact, if you go back to the original grant of the decision granting the automotive exemptions, there is a reference to the financial health of the industry as a reason for granting the exemption. You can't have it both ways. Now, having said that, it's not the only reason, but it is one of the rail transportation policies, and you're required to examine the rail transportation policies.
Thank you.
Just following up a little bit on that, you mentioned that there's a lot of differences within the transportation equipment sector, and that, well, again, a lot of things are hidden by averages that we mentioned before. Would you advocate, or would you think it'd be worth us considering whether or not we ought to revoke the exemptions for certain kinds of traffic beyond a certain distance? I think you mentioned in your testimony that the changes in the industry have caused shipments to become much, much longer, making certain kinds of traffic, like oversized pieces, et cetera, and long distance movements and finished cars, that there should be these separations, including some separations for movements of a certain distance. Do you think that is something the board should consider looking at?
Absolutely. I mean, the board should be looking at what portions of the traffic are still perhaps captive and require regulatory protection. And if that is based on a distance threshold and the evidence supports that, by all means, that would be acceptable.
Bruce, would you want to comment on that also?
No, I would agree. I don't look at this issue as a single matter. It's the entire collection of the issues that have been discussed here this morning, and absolutely it's possible to segment markets and find greater and lesser degrees of competition within what might be seen as a single market, but the segments are very important. I was astounded by some of the submissions to you and to the staff that to the degree of reference to re-regulation. I mean, I overwork sports analogies, but it's a head fake. It's if you watch where my head's going, you think that the basketball player's going there, and of course he goes over here and he scores the three-pointer. It's not about re-regulation. The Knit League is not a proponent of regulation of American industry. It is about providing appropriate statutory relief for shippers, a relief that 30 years ago they gave up willingly because there were other benefits, and today conditions have changed. And again, we commend the board to take a look deep inside that process.
Likewise, I'd like to caution that market abuse can occur in short-haul markets. It's a different kind of market abuse. And what we're suggesting is the market abuse is you have enough market power elsewhere. You don't want to compete in that market. You don't want to accept that traffic. That's something you should look into as well.
Just one last question. We have an awful lot of commodities, traffic types, et cetera, that are subject to the exemption. It'd be a very daunting task for the board to review all of those. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions as to what rule of thumb the board might follow when deciding what groups of traffic, commodities, et cetera, we might spend some time examining. Should it be the revenue to variable cost ratio, or do you have something else that you think would be useful for us to consider in looking at whether or not we ought to re-examine a particular exemption? Anybody can answer that.
I wish I had been smart enough to think of that question before you asked it. And I say that with only a little bit of a facetious tone, only because if individually exempted shippers and commodity groups and service classes, if we are to believe, and as I do, that some of them are quite concerned about retaliation from their carriers, if you were to put a sign-up sheet out in the lobby saying, if you would like us to look at your particular class or commodity, just sign here, I think that is going to not be attractive to a lot of shippers. So I think I'm respectfully coming back around to say I hope you guys come up with a process that allows for a good quantitative assessment that sort of starts to separate the groups into some natural zones for further examination, because I think there's going to be a reluctance from the shipper community to come in and say, well, take us.
Well, you always hate to hear that retaliation argument. We used to have these meetings every year between the railroads and the shippers, and we asked for comments or questions, and we were told that nobody would raise their hand because they were afraid of retaliation. Then we tried to have the questions submitted beforehand without names on them, and we tried bags on people's heads. There's always that argument, albeit the railroads claim that they do not retaliate, and it's not in their business interest to do such. So, but at any rate, thank you very much for your answers.
I just wanted to follow up with if I could on this issue that's been raised a couple times about concerns about railroad industry retaliation against customers. That's a very serious allegation. I just want to say that in my 5 years on the board, almost 5 years, I've not seen a single documented case. We've asked people in prior hearings to please come to us confidentially if they'd like to come to us and explain how that happens and why railroads would want to injure their customers. And I'm not naive. I understand that in the hustle and bustle of international commerce and competition, tough things can happen occasionally, but we're the regulatory agency. We need to know about that kind of stuff, and there are ways for us to know but we need people to step forward, and just coming to a hearing and kind of throwing it out there, that's a concern. With all due respect, we've got to have a little more than that, and I do appreciate the fact that all of you represent large numbers of constituents and stakeholders, and they've got a variety of major issues on their plate, especially in today's complex economic and regulatory world. But for us, we have to, as a board, and the chairman's deeply, intimately familiar with this, we have an allocation of resources issue internally ourselves. We've got to figure out which major issues we're going to take on as a 140-person, give or take a few employees agency. And I would say, just as one commissioner speaking for myself, it doesn't help us set priorities if individual stakeholders are not willing to come forward and actually explain to us what the problem is. It's helpful to have associations come forward and say that could be a problem. We should look at it generally, and maybe we might find out that there's really more of a problem. But many people, many of you represent, not all of you, many of you represent companies that are far bigger than any of the railroads, and talk about market leverage and all that, and with far more influence probably in the halls of Congress, some of you. I just think we need to. This agency would need to see. I believe, as one commissioner, folks to step forward and actually explain to us the specific problem for you to be able to effectively get this issue on the front plate. But other commissioners may have a different opinion. I respect that. I just need to say that. Thank you.
Mr. Vice Chairman, I can give you an example. The Consumer Protection Office was kind enough to send a delegation in 2004 to Green Bay to talk to a roomful of Wisconsin Central shippers who voiced their concern. The meeting was at the Railroad Museum, and it was indeed a room full, and they explained their services and the availability. I hesitate to tell you that I don't think there was a single informal complaint that resulted from that. Everybody walked out of the room with that. I'm not going to put myself in the way of it, because all of those shippers, while they have non-captive traffic, also have some captive traffic, and they're not going to put themselves in that situation.
Well, I appreciate that, but I mean, I've been to Wisconsin as a guest of Congressman Petri, who's, I believe, a champion of shipper and transportation issues generally, and I've visited with a large group of the Badger Cure folks, a number of people very interested and concerned about the Wisconsin Central. I've heard loud and clear the how many Wisconsinites deeply miss the good service of the Wisconsin Central and kind of that good attitude they seem to have had to just chase down business, whether it was highly profitable or minimally profitable, and serve all the customers. And I understand that. At the same time, in those meetings, I made myself available to speak privately with people afterwards, gave them my card, phone number. Nobody called me or pulled me aside privately and said, this is what I need to tell you. So we need to hear a little more specifics about something as serious as retaliation, because I think this board would stop everything we're doing and dig into that. We've recently had at least one significant case I can think of taking serious action against a Class 1 that we felt didn't adequately abide by STB processes, and I'm sure the board would do the similar if we had reason to.
I think part of the problem is that it may not be that there's retaliation, it's a perception. And so I wouldn't want to be saying, I'm pointing a finger at the railroad saying that you retaliated or would retaliate. It's just what the feedback is we have on the perception.
I would echo, it is a fear of the retaliation, and no one's willing to put themselves out there to be the guinea pig, to become the example. And in many cases, retaliation isn't done in a blatantly obvious form. It can be done in subtle ways, which there are often a dozen or other alternative explanations for it. And it's very hard to say, yes, that's the reason the railroad did this. But yet there's a feeling and a perception that that is the reason.
Thank you.
I would like to...
It sort of gets back to Professor Willis' contestability theory again. You don't really have to actually retaliate. Just the threat of retaliation or the fear of retaliation can be sufficient to discipline the behavior.
I'd like to thank the panel for their presentations, and I think we'll take an hour lunch break. So why don't we meet back here around 5 after 1, and we'll start off with the panel number 4 with the freight railroads. So we'll be in recess for about an hour.